Hey everyone, here's a quick review of Netflix's Jupiter's Legacy. Jupiter's Legacy is the story of Sheldon Sampson, a man whose father is killed in 1929. Him, his brother, and four other people go off to this mysterious island where they all gain superpower. The group become known as the Union of Justice, with two simple principles. Don't get involved in politics and do not kill anyone. After being the top superheroes for nearly a century, his children take up the mantles of superhero, but their ideals are far different from their father's, specifically the one about not killing, as they do subsequently kill his arch rival. As the tensions rise, it ignites a debate over what is morally right and wrong. So let's go with the positives and the negatives. First, the positive. I will say that the casting is pretty accurate and on point compared to the Mark Millar story of Jupiter's Legacy. They have a good handling of balancing from the young version to the old version without it seeming forced, and it works pretty well, especially the main character. The action scenes are pretty well choreographed, and the effects are pretty effective considering this is a Netflix series. Generally, with Netflix series, it can kind of go either way as looking cheesy or looking spectacular. There's kind of a middle ground for them, so I was happy to see what they did put into the series. The story is pretty accurate to the original comic, and that kind of leads into the downfall. So here are the negatives. The biggest issue with the series is, well, Mark Millar is not necessarily a great writer. He has done a lot of comics that, well, are just shock value for shock value's sake. His most famous work is probably Old Man Logan, Kick-Ass, The Ultimates. If you've read any of those, you know he has a habit of gore over substance. Which, if you like that, sure. Jupiter's Legacy, however, was his attempt to try to be seen as a serious, well-made writer, but could craft sprinkling out this idea of moral boundaries. But Mark Millar is unfortunately just not that good a writer to handle such topics. Jupiter's Legacy has a habit of bouncing of moral black and white, old man versus crazy young man mentality. The way he wrote the comic is essentially saying that if you grew up in the older generation, you're 100% right, and if you're in the younger generation, you're 100% wrong. Which everyone knows that's not morally how that works or anything works. But that's kind of Mark Millar's perspective on all of his writing. If you really pay attention to it, it's always more than less. It's always show the most you can and not what you should tone back on. If you want to see an adaptation of Jupiter's Legacy done correctly, I'd highly recommend reading the comic graphic novel called Kingdom Come. It's essentially the same story with the Justice League characters, but it's a one-off and it is spectacular and critically written to the point where they have been unable to do an adaptation of it because it's so good. The other problem I have with the series is, unfortunately, everyone could tell now, and is starting to see now, there has become this overwhelming fatigue of superhero content. You have the entire MCU, you have spin-off series, you have other adaptations. Everyone is trying to make a superhero comic. Some series have been slowly becoming developed, but they're not superhero series. Like, good example, the Lock and Key series. Sandman is getting adapted. Why the Last Man is getting adapted. The Walking Dead has been adapted. Those are comic book based, but they're not necessarily comic book based. And there is an appeal to taking comic books and putting them into a mainstream audience's perspective. The problem is more to do with when and how much is presented. And to be fair, there's kind of been an oversaturation of superhero content. And I don't necessarily think this is the series problem. Jupiter's Legacy came out at the worst possible time. A time when the MCU has been stagnating for a while. DCU is kind of up in the air what's good and what's bad. Amazon coming out with its original superhero content. All of these other channels that are trying to make superhero series. And it's just overwhelming to people, and unfortunately there has to be a catalyst, and It sucks that it had to be Jupiter's Legacy. If you looked at the promotional material for even Invincible, it really got a lot of press. It got a lot of things that are interested, but Jupiter's Legacy, even though the budget is really good and the effects and all that, it's really pretty accurate to the adaptation. It just came at the worst possible time with little to no success of having any sort of audience reaction because there was no press on it. There was nothing. There was no connection for the audience to relate to because nobody cared. If you don't care from the get go, why should we care? Unfortunately, which is not very shocking, it was canceled only after one season, which really kind of sucks because as someone who read Jupiter's Legacy, I will flat out admit the first arc is terrible. It is so boring and so dull. It doesn't hit its stride until at least the second arc onward. And it sucks that that's never going to be adapted unless they decide to make it an animated series, which maybe that could work. Who knows? I hate saying it, but Netflix was kind of right to cancel this series. I think more than anything, it has to do with when it came out than what came out. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Have you seen Jupiter's Legacy? Let me know what you thought in the comments down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, I'll see you next time.